Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 31. I'm Enigmius, and today it's all about the cosmetic detailing on the outer hull of the Samson. We're going to try and break up some of these flat bits a little bit with purely cosmetic details. They don't serve any kind of functional purpose whatsoever, or I should say they're not intended to serve any kind of functional purpose whatsoever. Anytime we're adding blocks to the outside of the ship, we're effectively adding armor under certain circumstances. But that's not the goal. We're not evaluating any of these components based on their ability to protect the ship. We're just adding things based on the visual interest that they provide, in the sense that there's all kinds of different things going on the outside of the ship that are interesting in and of themselves, but not so interesting that you fixate on them. And that's kind of the idea, is that it prevents you from fixating on any one thing to the extent that you kind of get sick of it, I guess would be one way of describing it. So if we've got these little cosmetic details happening all around the ship, it just kind of increases the longevity of the build in terms of how long you can stand to look at it before you get tired of it. You want to look at something else. In this case, I'm going with my tried and true, my multi-fin cooling component method of adding interest. It doesn't take a whole lot of time and effort. It's not necessarily difficult to design. We can try it. If it doesn't work, we can remove it. We can try something else. I like these kinds of designs because they look like they're functional because of that sort of heat sink kind of vibe that you get from them. All these different fins would help things cool faster by increasing the surface area that you could spread the heat to, and then have them basically sticking out into the frigid void of space and drawing that heat away. That's the general idea. Ultimately, my concern with this kind of design is that I want to try and make sure that I'm not overusing it, because it's very, very easy to do that. Use too much of this sort of general idea. But the guideline that I follow for doing this kind of thing is try something. If I don't like it, take it off, try something else. It's the easiest way that I can describe it. I don't think, for me anyways, that there's any kind of intuitive way of knowing ahead of time that I'm going to be happy with any one thing that I do, but I just do my best to kind of keep an eye on it and make sure that I'm evaluating it fairly and reasonably and giving it a certain amount of thought before we just start plastering it all over the ship like we're about to do. As I'm talking about evaluating things, I kind of had it in my mind ahead of time that I wanted to duplicate these to some extent along the length of this flat section on the upper part of the hull, but at the same time trying to keep in mind that if we overdo it, it's going to backfire. So you'll notice that we've got a couple of duplicated sections, and then we had a gap, and then we put another one in behind, and then we're breaking it up a little bit with this additional piece that I'm adding in. It's just strictly for the purpose of breaking up all the little smaller pieces with the fins. It's very, very easy to do this with very simple shapes and not necessarily suffer for it, as long as they're handled a little bit carefully. Like, you could just put rectangles all over the ship and not be too concerned about what it's going to look like in the grand scheme of things, because your eye isn't going to rest on it for so long that you look at it and think, that's dumb, that's just a rectangle. Look at all of the ships in the loading menus for this game. Clearly, there's a frame of mind somewhere that says a ship built exclusively out of boxes is a good design. So we're okay with using them to a lesser extent, I think. And again, it's just to kind of break up the flat sections, make them look a little bit more interesting. And you can see here, alongside the pipes, it's starting to look like the example that I had in my head as I was doing this is, if you look at the flat roofs of like schools or businesses or high rises, they've always got like the air conditioning units, and they've got different ventilation, they've got power boxes, they've got all kinds of these rectangular structures sitting on the roof of the building that serve all these different purposes. they aren't necessarily they don't have to be interesting looking, but they make the roof look more interesting than if it was just a plain flat roof, I guess is one way of describing it. So that's what we're kind of taking advantage of here, is that whole idea of putting things in a place where it looks like they've got some sort of purpose, but they aren't necessarily a purpose that we can describe. Here I decided to do kind of a rounded side for this particular section. Didn't have to be rounded, but I felt like doing something rounded just for the sake of being a little bit different from the other pieces that I'd been placing. I realized when I was getting to about this point that eventually I was going to have to start thinking about the colors that we were using on this ship. Specifically, I didn't think it would be a good idea to have all of these cosmetic pieces that we're placing here the same color as the ship itself, but I hadn't even decided on a color for the ship yet, so it made it a little bit difficult to decide what the color of those things would be. But before the end of the episode, we're going to mess around with a little bit of color just to kind of splatter things around and see what we end up with. I'm more or less done with the top section now, the very uppermost section, and now we have these big flat sections here heading down towards the front of the ship. In this case, I didn't even necessarily have an excuse for what I was putting in place aside from breaking up the flat bits, and you can see there's really nothing especially complicated about this design. It's very similar to the one rectangular shape that we put up on the flat section up top. Just kind of starting off with a very simple shape, adding a few embellishments, a few curves, a few angles. Break it up a little bit just because we can. It's quick and easy. We could have left it very close to a very plain rectangular sort of box shape, and I think it might have been successful, but in this case we're just adding that little bit of extra detail to it to kind of break it up and soften it a little bit, so it still draws at the eye a little bit, but not in that jagged sort of what's this rectangle sense that sometimes we get out of these different shapes as we're placing them. I wanted to be very, very careful here because one of the design goals that I had for this section of the ship was that we would have large armored chunks where we could place our turrets and not have to worry too much about them being easily destroyed by destroying the block that was holding them. And I wanted to be absolutely certain that whatever blocks I was placing, that I wasn't placing them on those hard points that we had created, because it's been a little while since we were working on that part of the ship. But I'm pretty confident that we would have had to go a little bit closer towards the front of the ship before we started running into those hard points. I think we're going to be okay. So the last sort of detail that I wanted to put on the top side of the ship, I guess you could say, more fins, and in this case they're all basically just stacked vertical fins, but I wanted them to kind of curve a little bit at an offset so that the ones towards the center of the ship would be a little bit longer, the ones towards the outside of the ship would be a little bit shorter, but they would all have the same curve. And consequently, you can see here just sort of a general idea, messing around with it and realizing that I was a little bit off on some of the blocks that I placed. And these blocks are temporary. The ones that we're working with now, they're just there so that we have something to line up the permanent blocks to get everything the right size, you know, the right position. We don't have to worry too much about doing it all manually, as we're also concerning ourselves with how we're going to manage to get the curves in place, to get everything the way that we want it to be done. It's fairly simple and straightforward. Again, me potentially, possibly, maybe overusing this idea of these little narrow fins. It's a good contrast, I think, when you've got all of these solid sort of pieces. When you can break them up a little bit with things that look less solid, it's just a little bit more interesting for me anyways. Creative license being what it is, you know, we each get to decide for ourselves ultimately what we're going to use and why. But the key here to making something like this work, when we've got multiple fins and we're working with different offsets and curves and things like that, is those temporary blocks above them that we're using to line everything up, because the match feature does a really good job of making it so that you can place a block and then you move your mouse cursor to, or mouse pointer to, a similar shape nearby, and it will automatically decide the size of the block to match the previous block that you placed. So you can do these things very, very quickly and easily, as long as you've got the setup to allow you to do that with the temporary blocks used as sort of like a backer. We've talked about this before, but I think occasionally it bears repeating, just because it's such a useful approach that I've found. It saves a lot of time. So you see, we've basically done this curve using all of these backer blocks, and now we go back and we erase all of our backer blocks, our temporary blocks, and what we're left with is the profile that we had in mind, and we put it together quickly and easily. It's uniform, it's exactly what I wanted it to be, and it didn't take as long as it could have if we were trying to align and scale all of these blocks individually without any kind of reference. Reference. You can see what we're left with is this this shape that the game sometimes has a hard time figuring out what should be getting that sort of scorched texture, that black thing that indicates that things aren't lined up, even though sometimes they are lined up and they just get the black texture anyways. It makes me a little bit nervous, because when I've done something that's a little bit more on the complex side, I feel obligated to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and see if I didn't actually miss something, and that's why it's making that black scorch kind of mark. Lately, however, it's just been a case of waiting a little bit longer for it to update, and then it gets rid of them. So I kind of looked at the little narrow pieces that we placed and decided that they were a little too flimsy looking on their own. So I decided to add a little bit to either side of those groupings, just to kind of, give it a little bit more structural oomph, a little bit more weight, so to speak, to give it the idea that they're actually going to be able to survive traveling through space and bashing off asteroids, meteorites, and all these little sort of things that can potentially damage the outside of a ship. We've got a little bit of extra heft to it now, so that we can justify in our minds having these things on the ship in the first place. So you're getting kind of an idea of the way things are going here. And now I decided would be a really good time to start messing around with a little bit of color. So the colors that I've chosen just for this sort of test are dark gray, which is going on now, with an orange color for the bands going around the cylinders in the main area of the hull. And you'll see more clearly what I'm referring to when I put them in place. It'll be impossible for you to miss, let's put it that way. And then black for some of the other details. So we've got sort of two shades of gray, ultimately with some orange, to provide a little bit of contrast on a ship that's supposed to look big and beefy and industrial, and intended to work hard and not just kind of fly around looking pretty. It doesn't take long to paint. Even on a ship with as many little small pieces creating the detail as we have, it just takes a little while to kind of go over it after you've done the initial pass and look for the little pieces that you inevitably miss. That's the time-consuming part, but it's still not that bad. So it took a little while to find an orange color that I was going to be happy with. But you can see there's definitely some contrast there. It's very, very easy to spot the difference between the gray and the orange, is what I'm trying to say. And I think it does okay. I'm not necessarily 100% sold on it, but it does provide that contrast. It kind of breaks up the dark stuff. The orange, I think, is a good industrial sort of color. It's, you see it on a lot of equipment in present day, yellowish, orangish sort of industrial things. Then the idea is to make it easy to spot so that you don't get killed by it because you didn't know it was there. That's sort of the idea. Not necessarily to say that this is going to be the final color scheme for the ship, but it's that trial, that little bit where we've got a little bit more left to do with the detailing. So while we're doing that, this can sit with these colors and we can get sort of an idea whether or not we're going to be happy with it before we settle on it as the final color, or decide to change it up and see if we can't come up with something better. So the next episode is going to be kind of the reveal, I guess you could say. The last little cosmetic details will be in place. The final color scheme will be in place. We're going to look at hopefully 2 versions of the ship, this version and the scaled down version. And if everything checks out, if everything appears to be working the way I would like it to, it will also come with the blueprints. So we'll do a little bit of a shakedown. We'll make sure that we're happy with the performance. And then if all systems are green, then we'll release the blueprint. And if not, we'll make some tweaks and we'll release the blueprint the episode after. One way or the other, we're within 2 episodes maximum of releasing the blueprint and finishing this build before we move on to the next. So if you want to be notified about the next and future episodes in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.